Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Planning Committee meeting today. I shall be chairing the meeting today. My name is Alan Powell. I'll first ask if we have any apologies.
Yes, Chair. Apologies have been received from Councillor D. Ruff, Councillor D. Hancock and Councillor J. Ridgway. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I should have said before then that we have two applications to consider this afternoon, along with reports on planning appeals and on planning and enforcement. I'm happy with this and intend to consider the business as stated on the agenda. Are there any other apologies from anyone on the floor?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Second item is declaration of interest, which is a formality that we go through at every meeting. Members are requested to declare the existence and nature of any disclosable pecuniary interest and or other interest not already on their register of interests in any item on the agenda and withdraw from the meeting at the appropriate time. Do any members have any interest to declare?
None received, Chair.
Thank you very much. We now move on to item 3, minutes of the last meeting. We have the minutes in front of us or sent to us from our meeting held on the 17th of May, which wasn't all that long ago, really, was it? Are we happy that these are a correct record? If so, can somebody propose? Thank you. That's proposed by Councillor Armitage and seconded by Councillor Elliott. Those in favour? Thank you. The motion is carried. Now, it brings us on to the main business of the meeting. But before we start, I'd like the clerk to explain to the benefit of members of the public and those watching on YouTube, how we will deal with the applications today. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. This is the procedure for considering the applications this afternoon. The Chair will introduce the application, then ask the planning officers to refer members to any late comments or updates received since the agenda was issued. The late items agenda supplement has been published on the Council's website and hard copies have been circulated to you. The planning officers will then give a brief presentation setting out the application plans and photographs from the site. After this, the Chair will ask the speakers to address the meeting. Each of the speakers will have 3 minutes to put forward their views. There'll be a reminder given by the clerk when 30 seconds remain. At the end of the speaker's 3 minutes, members of the committee will have an opportunity to ask the speaker questions, if necessary, to clarify any points they have made. When we have heard from all the speakers on an application, the Chair will open up the meeting for debate by the committee and ultimately determination by a vote. The votes will be taken by roll call. After a speaker has addressed the committee and answered any questions, then they will be allowed to remain in the chamber, but they will not be allowed to participate further from that point. Similarly, those who participate by Zoom may continue to view the meeting, but they must remain muted and turn their cameras off so that they too play no further part. Now, as you're aware, this meeting is being live streamed and a recording will be placed on the Council's website. Please note that others may choose to copy it. Thank you, Chair.
Let's move on then to our first application. This is a Section 73 application pursuant of 18/00801/FL to vary condition 2, brackets approved plans, end brackets, to Erzamine or Erzamine, I don't know whether I pronounced that correctly, High Stairs Lane, Stretton. In line with our normal procedure, I'm going to ask the planning manager, Mr. Kirkham, and officers to tell us about any late comments that have been received and to give a brief presentation showing pictures and plans of the site. I will allow the officers to complete the presentation. Consequently, members, could you please reserve any points of order or questions about the process until the end? There'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions later on. Mr. Kirkham.
Thank you, Chair. The application on the agenda this afternoon, Chair, seeks consent to amend the location of a previously approved dwelling to position approximately 6 metres to the north and slightly to the west of its approved location, The dwelling is otherwise as consented, save a minor alteration to the fenestration on the west elevation. And the dwelling that has been permitted previously, Chair, that remains extant with the consent granted, partially implemented by the construction of a dwelling. In view of the consent in place, the two primary issues members will need to assess this afternoon are any additional impact caused to the character of the area and/or any unacceptable impact on residential amenity. In this regard, Chair, officers conclude that whilst the building would move closer to Moorfields, due to the blank elevation facing it and the single-storey nature of the proposed dwelling when viewed from Moorfields, the impact is acceptable. The recommended conditions, Chair, are as set out in your report. However, should consent be granted, I would like to review the previously imposed conditions and reimpose any considered still necessary, as members, I'm sure, will be aware that any consent granted this afternoon would need to stand alone. Just in terms of the presentation, Chair, I won't repeat what we saw at the site visits yesterday, but just to go through a few slides. The application site, as is customary, Chair, is at the centre of the slide, and it's coloured in beige. And you can see High Stairs Lane just to the north of the site, with the A61 almost to the right-hand side of the slide. The application site, Chair, outlined in red, and as I've mentioned previously, consent has been granted for the construction of two dwellings on this site, one of which has now been constructed, as we saw yesterday. The application that was approved, and we're looking at only the plot one, which is the right-hand side of these two plots, but previously consented in the position outlined in red on the slide, Chair. So that's what has an extant consent, and you can see that part of that crosses over where there's an existing building that would be demolished, and the application seeks consent to move that dwelling to a position that is then shaded in, so to the north and slightly to the west, as I've said. The details, as we saw yesterday, they are the same as those previously approved, Chair, but with the detailing on the west elevation slightly amended to have an additional upper floor window, and the two centre windows at the lower ground floor, they are two halves of what was a double window previously consented. And there's just a couple of photographs, Chair, as aid memoir. This is taken from the centre of the site, and you can see the bungalow in the background there. That's one of the two consented dwellings, so that's been erected, and the bungalow to the left-hand side, that would be demolished to make way for the new unit, which would be on the application site in the foreground. And then just finally, Chair, as we saw yesterday, this is just a photograph taken looking towards the site from the west, from a public footpath, and you can make out in the middle distance the dwelling that's been constructed, and then you can just see the bungalow that would be demolished to make way for the further unit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkham. I'm now going to invite speakers to address the committee. As the clerk has already explained, they will each have 3 minutes to get over their points, and will be informed when 30 seconds remain. As members, you can ask speakers to clarify any matters that have been raised, but remember your question should only relate to the points that have been already made. I would now like to ask our first speaker, Stephen Ross, who is objecting to the application, to come and address the committee. If you'd sit at the table there, sir, and if you would press the button in front of the microphone and the light should come on to say it's red. Thank you, you've done that. Can you confirm that this is your name and that you understand the process?
Yes.
If so, you have 3 minutes. Off you go.
Okay. I live at Moorfields to the east of Earsham Mine, which stands around 25 metres from where it is, from us. When it's demolished, the new one would be about 8 metres from us. And if this application goes through, bring it down to 4 metres from us. The reason is the site was never big enough to accommodate these two. enormous properties. The application was a result of an oversight by the family doing the development. That when the old bungalow is demolished, they'll have nowhere to live. Although the son has built his house already and they've been living there for a couple of years. I was astonished that the development ever got the go ahead, given all the reasons for its refusal in the first place. Reasons such as planning policy seeks to ensure that dwellings are not materially larger than the one it replaces or has a greater impact on the setting. The development would be incongruous in scale, massing, design, and orientation. These are just some of the reasons given for refusal in the first place of this application. Overall, the proposals would result in significant harm to landscape, environment, and countryside, being contrary to policies GS1, GS6, BE1, H3, and NE1 of the North East District Council local plan, and policies SS1, SS9, SDC12, and SDC3 of the local plan. How many more reasons do you need? So what changed on appeal? We bought our house in 2004 after viewing it and being wowed by the views to the west over the Amber Valley. This will all now but disappear. For us, the damage was done when permission was granted on appeal for this
30
development.
seconds.
All we ask is that the permission that was granted at appeal stays as is. From the start, our concerns have never been considered. So we're just asking for some consideration, as the damage to us has already been done.
Thank you. Have any members any questions for the speaker? Councillor Rouse.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ross. Could you tell me where your house is in comparison to Esamine?
It's to the east.
To the east?
Yeah.
That's like on the opposite side of the road?
No.
No?
No, it's over the hedge.
Over the edge. Right, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else? No. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would now like to ask Mr. Joseph Rolls, apologies if I've got that wrong as well, who is the applicant, to now address the committee. Can you confirm that this is your name and that you understand the process?
Yeah, that's my name, Joseph Rolls, and I do understand the process.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I don't have much to say, but I just wanted to thank you for the time today to consider this variation to the size of the plot, to the location of the plot, I mean. As you're aware, we've completed plot 2, and I'm living in that property now, and it's been well received by the residents of the lane. We've had some very good comments from our neighbours. Having completed that house, we started to plan out the second property, and we quickly realised that we'd overlooked the fact that this property is much closer to the field than the property that I live in. This is creating a much smaller rear garden than the front garden. The front garden is much larger than the rear. And because it's the way it's been set, it's actually offset on the plot. So we've took some counsel. We spoke to our architect, the planning consultant, and the planning team here. And we looked at all the benefits of moving the plot forward. And we came up with these benefits. If we move it away from the open field boundary, that will be a benefit to the countryside. It will straighten up the building line with plot 2. It will increase the distance between the house and the countryside, which I've already mentioned. And it will centralise the property on the plot, which increases the rear garden and makes it much more in proportion because it is a family house. I'm looking ahead, it will be a family house. I know my dad and mum will be living in it for a while, but looking ahead, it will be a family property. We have taken into consideration the other properties around the site, and we have concluded that this move will not adversely affect anyone in any way. So overall, I think the feeling is that the proposed new layout on the site will be much better for the environment, the landscape, and the overall layout of the finished project. I trust this makes sense and enables you to support this amendment. If you've got any questions, I'll try and answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Has anybody got any questions? Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Could you tell me, we're from last speaker, that the house currently with what was proposed to be built is 21 metres from that boundary, and if you move it, it's going to be up 4 to 8 metres. Is that correct?
No, I think what Mr. Ross was referring to is the current property that's on the site, Erzenmine
The old
bungalow,
bungalow,
the old bungalow that's been removed. That's 25 metres away.
Right.
So we are moving the property slightly to the north, but it makes very little difference, as you saw on the drawing.
But the one we passed plans for originally, how far away from that property will it sit, or would it have sat before this move?
So we're moving the whole property is moving by approximately 6 metres. So I'm not sure how big Mr. Ross's garden is, but there's a 4 metre strip of land between our property and then his property, which is a strip to the field.
To the boundary, not to the property.
Sorry, between our boundary and the neighbour's boundary, there's actually a strip of land which accesses the field in the rear,
Right.
and then there's his garden.
Right.
And our property is 2 metres from the boundary.
Right. Thank you.
I don't know whether you can show it on the drawing again.
Yeah, if you could bring up the drawing, Adrian, that'd be great. Thank you.
Just to try and help Chair, the property that Mr. Ross, this property, this is Moorfields, and as we saw yesterday, there's a field boundary, a field access running down here with a Harris fencing was up against, and then in terms of the property, you can see what was approved is the red, and then what is proposed is outlined. Sorry, is outlined. You've got it here.
Doesn't quite show you the bungalow, the existing bungalow, bottom left. Top.
The existing bungalow is here.
Yeah.
See how far away that is from us.
Sorry. So, Chair, do you mind, Adrian? Can I just confirm then that if this bungalow is moved back, or if the original one is built, it would be built closer to Mr. Ross's than if we allow it to be moved back in the field, towards the field?
No, Chair, just so to be absolutely clear, the one that has consent is outlined in red.
Right.
So that's the one that's permitted, and the one that is proposed is that one. So that's the blocked out one.
The shaded one was the.
No, it's the other way around. The red outline is the one consented, and the one that's blocked is proposed. And you can see that Mr. Ross's property is here. I'm afraid I don't have the exact measurements, Chair, I'm afraid, but that's the property that Mr. Ross has spoken to you about.
Yeah.
And then so his property is approximately here. That's the approximation.
6 meters closer to that property.
It will be towards Mr. Ross's property, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott. Any other members? Councillor Foster.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I suppose my concern with this, and I'll be careful how I would describe this, Mr. Rules, but you originally asked for planning permission. It was granted for the one where it is now and the other one that's in red. And I could see that going through. Maybe if you'd have come with this one as it's proposed now, we might have looked at it different. So that's my immediate thoughts on the matter. That's just my thoughts first. My question is you mentioned about wanting to move it, and after you've took council and said that you wanted it more in line, you want it in the centre of the plot. It's quite obvious when you look at it initially, even from the very beginning, that it's not in the centre of the plot. To give that as a reason now for wanting to move it, it's very similar to placing it well outside the plot in another county, and then now wanting to put it in the plot. It's that different. It's obvious back then. So that's my first question. What are your thoughts on that? Why did you suddenly realise once you'd got planning permission? Why did you realise it wasn't in the centre?
Well,
That's the first question.
so yeah, you're right. We always planned to do plot 2 first, because that's the house that I've moved into. And when we actually came to mark it all out, we realised that the garden is going to be smaller. So yeah, I mean, we should have noticed at the beginning, and we should have actually spoken to the architect about it, Alistair Haxton. But he put forward the proposals, and we let it go through. So I think it's an oversight from when we were actually doing the original planning.
I take your answer, Mr. Rolls, that it's an oversight, although I've only looked at it for a very short time. It looked like no oversight from me from the very start. I think that's clear to me anyway. And the second one is about the 4 benefits you mentioned, which are counted. Can't recall them all. Some of those are about centralising the plot, putting it in line, and that it wouldn't affect the amenity of anyone. So you said conclude that it won't affect anyone, but we've obviously heard from the neighbour, the first chap that spoke, Mr. Ross, that it does affect his amenity. So it's not entirely fair to say that. So just your comments on that, please, that it won't affect anyone else. Obviously, it's going to affect Mr. Ross.
I think the way we looked at it, and we took counsel on this, that where the property is at the moment, and if we move it back, the view, we do accept that building a property where it's initially got planning for now, that will affect Mr. Ross's view. But if the house is in that position or in the new position, it makes no difference, because the only window, I believe, is a dormer window at high level, which looks over the top of property. So whether the property is in location A or location B, it won't make any difference.
I won't press it too much further, Chair, but just enough to say that it obviously affects Mr. Ross's view, and I believe that's why he's here. But thank you for the answers. Thank you, Chair.
Anyone else have any questions for Mr. Rolls? No. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, as per our normal procedure, you will now have the opportunity to put questions to the officers about the application. Again, as the real chair of the planning committee will always say, I would like you to keep this part of the proceedings focused on getting clarity about the points you're not sure of. Once we've done that, we can then have our discussion on the application. That's when we will debate it, based on all that you have heard and read. And I would be grateful if you would not move any motions at this stage. Let's wait until we've had a chance to conclude the debate. So therefore, members, have you any questions for the planning manager? Councillor Armitage.
Thank you, Chair. Well, you showed us the visual, Adrian, but you didn't show the photograph which you had at the site meeting yesterday. The one that shows Mr. Ross's the view and his dormer window, which you had yesterday. Perhaps you could show us that again.
Yeah.
Because I think it shows the effect of the amenity value of Mr. Ross's house and how it will be damaged by this proposal.
Whilst the planning manager is looking at that, I would remind you that the loss of view is not a planning matter. There's nothing in the planning system that allows for that. And we would then have to identify what you mean by amenity.
yes.
Is the photographs, Chair, that we saw yesterday. It's not our normal practice to reprise them, but I'll just go through them and come to the one that Councillor Armitage, I think, is particularly referring to. There's that's what we saw as the entrance into the site yesterday, and you can see this is the field entrance that we discussed yesterday, Chair, and the application site then in the middle distance. And just getting to the one that I think that Councillor Armitage particularly was raising reference to. This is the so that's Mr. Ross's property, and you can see the dormer window in the upper story, and then the windows in the ground floor. You can also see, Chair, the changing levels and the hedges that we saw yesterday. I think that's the one that Councillor Armitage in particular is.
If we go back to it, where it's photographed from is actually lower ground. So it isn't just the window, the dormer window, it's the windows lower down. You can just see the top of them. Now, if you take it on the same level or taking it from Mr. Ross's side, you would see that that would be the whole length would be obstructed by moving this building forward. And that's my point, is that we know that loss of view isn't a planning matter, but it's the amenity value of it. The gentleman bought that house with the amenity of it, and just moving this site forward, it's going to stop all of that. But if it had remained where it is, if you look at the plan, the block plan, it will be behind a number of very large trees, which would shield it from Mr. Ross's, his garden, basically. And, I think that it's far too near to the boundary with the proposal, and it would be better where it was. I mean, they should have realised when they did it that, okay, the garden's going to be a bit smaller.
So what's your question to the officer, Councillor Armitage?
Well, it was the fact that we didn't see the correct photograph, which shows the actual, the dormer window, one of the most salient facts of this planning application.
Thank you. Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Chair. At the beginning, Mr. Kirkham said the two things we've got to consider: the impact on the character of the area and impact on residential amenity. I don't have any difficulty with impact on the character of the area compared, because that's already, I think that's already been covered in the first application that was granted. I think that, for me anyway, that satisfies me, that part. But the impact on residential amenity, I'd like some further advice from Mr. Kirkham on what our chair mentioned earlier. Now, we understand the loss of view isn't always a planning consideration, but the impact on residential amenity. Perhaps if we can have we could have a further explanation on that, because to me, I understand it that a view can be in that amenity. It can be not solely on that, but it is to do with and it's connected with that. That's how I've always understood it before. So perhaps a better definition from Mr. Kirkham and to give us more advice on that and what we're able to rule on. Thank you.
Just in relation to that, Chair, and Jenny may have something to say on this if I get it wrong. She's on Zoom and will correct me if legally I get this wrong. But my understanding, Chair, is that the loss of view is not a material planning matter. So the fact that somebody may be able to enjoy a particular outlook and the loss of that by development wouldn't be a material matter. But just in terms of the point that Councillor Foster is making, amenity would normally be for a planning consideration to be impact on the general amenity. So for example, if there was a large building at the end of your garden that you currently have light looking over a hedge, and there was a 2 or 3 story building at the end of the garden, you might consider that an impact on the amenity of the garden. you would certainly assess amenity in terms of how a building, whether it be a new building, as in this case, or an extension, how that would affect living room windows, so kitchens, lounges, and other primary rooms that you would expect a level of light and what we would bundle up as amenity to be associated with, and you would look to protect that. So it's those sort of areas that we would normally associate amenity with, not impact of view. So you've mentioned overbearing, overlooking would all be within that. In this instance, Chair, from the officer's point of view, we've taken our stance on it on the back of the fact that the proposed elevation that would be closest to Moorfields is single story. There's the hedging in between, and it's Moorfields at a slightly higher level than the site itself. And the other element we've taken into account, Chair, is the fact that the opening closest to Moorfields is a garage, so there wouldn't be any direct window-to-window issues. So that's the reasoning that officers have taken. But of course, as in all cases, Chair, members will need to take a view as to whether you similarly see it in that form, or you take a different view. Hopefully I've got that right, and Jenny hasn't got any clarification, Chair, but I'm sure she'll come in if
yeah, Chair, that is correct. Residential amenity, it's not defined in law, and it's just elements that are particularly relevant to the living conditions of a dwelling. So in essence, that's what it is.
Thank you. Any other questions for the officers? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. To the east, where the road is between the properties, there's a dense area there of trees or shrub. How dense is that? And if this was to be granted, would it aid the situation if there was some further planting?
I can probably best answer that for Councillor Cooper, Chair. If I just go back to the photographs, Chair, and that's the first one that Councillor Armitage asked for. So you can see a hedge on the site boundary, and then behind the Harris fencing, that's the field access, and then the hedge behind there. And then further around, that's the group of trees that are referenced on the drawing. So they're in position. So the site proper, you can just see behind the vehicle here, there is a gap in the hedge. So there may be facility to plant that up, and you can see on the block plan that's indicated on the drawing that would be completed. So the two bits of missing hedge there, you can see the left-hand element of that towards the other one could be filled in. It may help, Chair, but I think you would need more than just hedging, and it wouldn't provide an immediate screen. And of course, if you got vegetation growing to a height, that would potentially have an impact on Moorfields as well, as much as any building. But of course, the planting of trees, shrubs wouldn't in itself, Chair, require planning consent. There certainly wouldn't normally be any control then over the height that they could grow through planning anyway. I hope that's helpful, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. Anyone else? Right, well, we now come to the final part of our consideration of this application, and a discussion about what we've heard and what we think and what we want to decide. Before going any further, I'd just like the clerk to remind us about motions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Please bear in mind, members, that a motion must be moved and seconded before a vote is taken. If an amendment to a motion is moved and seconded, then the amendment will be voted on first. If a motion is to be moved which goes against the officer recommendations, then the member who has moved the motion must give the reasons for doing so. The reasons for moving a motion against officer recommendations should comprise the relevant planning issues and be supported by the evidence as necessary. If a motion to reject officer recommendation falls, or in other words, it is not passed, That doesn't mean that the recommendations are automatically approved. Rather, you will need to take a positive decision through a further motion in favour of the recommendations or a different course of action. This will need to be approved by the committee through another vote. In terms of the timings of the motions, these should be moved and seconded after the committee has heard, read and discussed the evidence before it. The chair will indicate when this point has been reached and will then invite motions to be put. Members will be reminded of this by the clerk if they wish to propose a motion before then. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you to the clerk for that. I'd now like to open the floor for debate. Again, as the clerk is just reminding us, could you please refrain from moving any motion until we've had concluded our discussion? I'll open the floor. Councillor Elliott, then Councillor Armitage.
Thank you, Chair. I was sat on the committee when we passed this back in the day, and I was only happy about it because it was going to be built into the bank of the land, into the topography of the land, and it did give no overbearing or no overpowering feel to the properties around it. I wasn't totally comfortable with it, but it was the best we could get from it. It may have been an oversight for the back garden, but I don't think, and I don't like the fact that it's moving 6 metres forward just to give a bigger back garden and close to someone else's property and making it overbearing and overpowering for the people that live there. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Armitage.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the things that it's a very, very prominent site, and this was, as Councillor Elliott's pointed out, it was sort of the best of a bad job that we got it, that we passed it, and I think moving it forward, it's like Councillor Elliott said, it will impact on the neighbouring property, and I don't think that. Well, I'm not happy with it. Let's put it like this: to be going forward like that, it should be where it was passed, and it should be left there. If you look at it from a distance, it's got the backdrop of those big trees, and you don't see it. It doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, like it would do if you moved it where there isn't a backdrop. You can mention about planting trees, but the tree screening is already there and it's mature. If you go and move it forward, you're going to have to plant those trees, and it's going to be 20 years before you're going to get an effective screen. I think we should leave it where it is.
Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Chair. This for me, it could be one way or the other for me, but when I think about those 4 benefits that have been mentioned by Mr. Rolls, I can see those benefits, but the benefits to himself and to the property. And then I think about Mr. Ross and his situation, and he is obviously affected, and there is an impact there, and you can see it coming in advance. They're my initial thoughts on it. And then I've settled where I often do settle. Someone's rights to do what they want in their area, on their ground, with their building, they finish where someone else's rights begin, I find. And I think what's happening on this piece of land is affecting Mr. Ross on his piece of land. So he's got a right to enjoy his residential amenity. I do take officers' advice in that they don't think that this is the case. That there's no unacceptable impact on the amenity of neighbours. But for myself, the first part that we had to consider, impact upon the character of the area, no, but certainly impact on residential amenity for myself, especially after the explanation we've had about elements to the living conditions of the dwelling. How we've had that described by officers. So I can see that it does, and we've had the chap himself saying it does affect him, and you take people on the word. And yeah, anything else I'll be repeating what my colleagues had said. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Foster. Anyone else? Right. Mr. Kirkham, do you want to comment on anything that has been said in that debate before I ask for motions?
No, Chair. Happy to take any further clarification, but nothing I would wish to add. Thank you.
Right. Well, having heard and read everything today and the office recommendations before us, what is the view of the committee on the application? So I now open the floor to a motion. Councillor Armitage.
Yeah, I'd go against officer's recommendation on this, on the effect of the amenity on this.
Could you be a bit more specific?
Well, it's going to, it's going to the living conditions of the gentleman next door. I think it will grossly affect his amenity.
Mr. Kirkham, do you need any clarification on the specifics of that amenity element?
In framing a motion, Chair, the adjectives that have been used in the debate are overbearing, overpowering, prominent, impact on residential amenity. To frame a reason for refusal, should members choose to refuse the application, Chair, if it's on those grounds, it would be if any or all of those are appropriate. And of course, members are aware of your policy SDC 12, which raises the issue of protecting the amenity of existing occupiers. So again, it would be my suggestion, Chair, if members are minded to refuse the application on that grounds, in terms of a policy you may wish to hang that on, that would probably be the most appropriate. But without members advising otherwise, Chair, I would suggest that any reason for refusal would include the adjectives overbearing and prominent. I wouldn't recommend using overpowering, and also the issue about impact on residential amenity and the living conditions of occupiers of the property. Apologies, Chair, but I think it's the property of Moorfields that I think is of concern to members.
I'll go along with that then, Adrian, with your suggestion.
Excuse me. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Foster.
Yeah, happy to second that motion. If we include SDC 12, overbearing, prominent, and that it's affecting the living conditions of the dwelling of Moorfields and impact on residential amenity. Happy to second that, Chair.
Thank you. Right, well, we have a vote and we will do this by roll call.
Just be absolutely clear, Chair, then. So the motion is to reject the application against officer recommendations on the grounds that the property or the development will be overbearing and prominent, go against policy SD 12 in terms of the impact on the amenity of the neighbouring resident. At the essence of it, members? SDC 12, I should say, Chair.
There are some others there that I wouldn't mention if I was
Yeah, apologies, Chair, but just SS1, SS2, SS9 and SDC3.
So it's SDC 12 and the other policies which just mentioned. Okay, thank you, Chair. So I'll now carry out the roll call, Chair, with your permission. Councillor Armitage. Councillor Cooper. Councillor Elliott. Councillor Foster. Councillor Hall.
For.
Councillor Hartshorn.
Against.
Councillor Liggett.
For.
Councillor Jones.
Against.
Councillor Powell.
Against?
Councillor Rouse.
Against.
Right, Chair. 5 people voted, 5 members have voted for, 4 have against, 1 has abstained. On that basis, the motion has carried. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, we now move on to the second application, which is a retrospective application for a garage with store at Crofton Vale, Alton Lane, Littlemore, Ashover. And again, in line with our normal practice, I'm going to ask the planning manager and officers to tell us about any late comments reports that have been produced and to give a brief presentation showing any photos and plans of the site. I will allow the officers to complete the presentation. Consequently, members, would you please reserve any points of order or questions about the process until the end of the presentation? Thank you, Mr. Kirkham.
Apologies, Chair. I just need to share my screen. That's to where we are. Thank you. Firstly, Chair, on application 22-00244, I just refer members to the late comments report that was sent out yesterday. This application, Chair, is seeking to obtain consent to retain a garage that's been erected close to and serving an approved bungalow. It replaces in part a number of derelict structures and buildings. Primary issues that members will need to address in this instance are the impact of the garage on the character of the area and any impacts on neighbouring amenity. It's important to note, however, Chair, that any private matters such as ownership are matters for the parties and not for planning committee to resolve or consider. Officers have concluded, Chair, as members will note, that due to the small scale of the garage, the materials used and the distance from the neighbouring property, that the garage is acceptable. I'll just go through a few slides, Chair, but again, not to repeat what we saw on the site visit yesterday, but the application site is hatched and the garage, Chair, in the location in the western corner, and you can just make out the buildings that formerly occupied the site, albeit in a relatively poor state when they were taken down. The bungalow that's being constructed is extant, and there's also the rebuilding of this property, again, that's been granted consent. So both those are authorised. There's the application site, Chair, showing the bungalow that's been approved and then the replacement dwelling that's been approved. And you can see the neighbouring properties next door, whose gardens also extend to the extent where the rear garden of the bungalow falls. So in terms of the detailing, Chair, these are a depiction of the buildings that formerly occupied the site. And then that's the structure that's been constructed and which you'll see in a second. You will recall, Chair, at yesterday's site visit, the query was raised with regards to the wall to the rear of the site. And this shows on the right-hand side the bungalow that's been constructed. And you'll be able to see on the left-hand side that the boundary wall has been constructed of stone. And also, Chair, a photograph of the garage itself with the steps leading to it. And again, you can see the rear boundary wall constructed of stone. And I hope that clarifies the matter raised at site visit yesterday. But that is the structure that's been built. That's the garage. And then finally, Chair, that's a picture of the garage from the front. And you can see the bungalow that's been approved and is being constructed, but is yet unoccupied to the right-hand side. So it's the garage that members are being asked to consider in this instance, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkham. We have only one speaker who is joining us by Zoom. I would now like Thurza Helen Sanderson, who is objecting to the application, to address the committee.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Right, yeah, we can see you and hear you. Right, can you just confirm that that is in fact your name and that you understand the process?
That is correct, and I do understand the process. Thank you.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. The main points from a planning perspective are the negative ecological, visual and audio impacts caused by the removal of dry stone features and vegetation along the entire boundary between the rear garden of Oakroyd and the Crofton Vale plots. An overbearing 2-storey garage store of an obscure shape has already been built along the boundary. That building is of significantly greater height and sits much further forward than the dry stone outbuilding that was originally sited on that boundary. The garage door has been built with a breeze block elevation facing Oakroyd. The replacement boundary wall is also breeze block, which is neither representative of the character of the area, nor does it provide a habitat for wildlife. The garage store now sits directly next to a pond and waterfall. The pond is a habitat for wildlife, including frogs and newts, and has been a focal feature of the Oakroyd rear garden for 27 years, with a seating area directly next to it. There are no soft landscaping schemes or ecological documents submitted for this particular 2022 application. The ecological and arboricultural reports for this site date back to the original 2016 application for the associated new bungalow on the site at Crofton Vale. Despite being unaware of the ponds in the locality, those reports highlighted the ecological importance of the original dry stone walls and the vegetation along the peripheries. The updated 2019 application for the new bungalow showed that the dry stone wall adjacent to the Oakroyd pond and the waterfall would be retained, with a new hedge being introduced directly behind it. One of the conditions of the 2019 approval was for the implementation of the boundary treatments. If this 2022 planning application is approved, the boundaries detailed in 2019 alongside Crofton Vale and Oakroyd can no longer exist. That hedge served 2 important purposes from a planning aspect. The first being an ecological habitat next to the original dry stone wall, the pond and the waterfall, and the second being a privacy screen for the 2 new overlooking bedroom windows which directly face and are close to the Oakroyd rear garden. Those overlooking windows to habitable rooms were introduced by the current developer in the 2019 application. The bungalow that was approved in 2016 had an integral garage and a utility room closest to the Oakroyd property, with only a small window for an ensuite facing Oakroyd. The new garage is now located at the top of the Crofton Vale plot, with no provision for replacement soft landscaping along the entire boundary. Along with the visual character, ecological and privacy issues highlighted, there will also be a potential for noise disturbance with cars coming and going along that new boundary. I am deeply saddened by this 2022 planning application. Had I been allowed to comment before the building was commenced, I may have been able to mitigate some of the negative impacts.
Chair.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions for the speaker? Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Sanderson's addressed quite a few points there. Perhaps just a bit of clarity on something that's in our report. You mentioned about different harms to the area. We've got in 8.1, it says to us, and this is a chance for you to perhaps explain a little further, where harm is identified, the application should be refused. So if you'd like to just recap on some of those for me, please, so I can take note of that.
Absolutely. So for me, one of the biggest impacts is the ecological effect of the fact that the new garage is now wrapping round a pond and a waterfall. Previously, which was sited there, was a dry stone wall. And my mother and my father and the lady that used to live next door purposefully didn't put any hard boundaries around that area. They installed cement posts with a fence which the wildlife could come and go between. And they put vegetation along the entire boundaries. So on the Crofton Vale site, that used to be conifers and rhododendrons and laurels, and on the Oakroyd site, it was again rhododendrons and laurel hedging and things like that. And so that allowed the creatures from around that pond area to come and go. What is now there is a solid breeze block wall with a fence on top, which is a totally full boundary, which will prevent that wildlife coming and going. There's no vegetation at all down the entire of the southern boundary between Oakroyd and Crofton Vale. It's all been completely stripped out. And what has been put at the top is now a solid garage which wraps around entirely around that pond. That is one of the kind of important aspects for me. I was actually living at the property when that pond and waterfall was built by my parents, and I actually helped to build it. And so I understand the importance, exactly from an amenity of a residential area, of what that top corner of that garden represents with regards to the rear garden at Oakroyd. And this is why it's deeply saddened me in particular, because I lived there for 10 years. So that's one of the first points. The second point is that it's overbearing. Having lived there for 11 years, I'm well aware of what was previously there. It was a dry stone outbuilding where the site from the Oakroyd back garden was very low. It was completely, the roof had caved in, but the walls that reached up to the elevation actually sloped away from the Oakroyd boundary. What's been put there now is a 2-storey garage, where the actual elevation right on the boundary has been extended from what was an outbuilding which was further along into the Crofton Vale plots. And they've extrapolated the height of that building, which was definitively 1-storey, not 2-storey. And I have photographs, fortunately, with my children in, so I haven't shared them, that date back 27 years and show the original roof on that building.
That's fine, Mrs. Sanderson. Chair, could I ask just one small question on the back of that?
You can.
The approximate diameter of the pond you're talking about, Mrs. Sanderson?
Wow.
Just approximately.
Now you're asking.
As big as.
It's probably about 5 or 6 meters in the width. I did include photographs of it in my original representation, so I know you probably can't go back and look at that now. Yeah, I would say it's about 6 meters in width. I can lie completely in it, and I'm 5'10", if that's helpful. In fact, my husband can also lie in it as well, and he's 6 foot. So yeah, across the width of it, I would say it's about 6 foot, so about 2 meters, but at the kind of narrowest point, and then it's probably about, I'm not very good with this, probably about maybe 4 meters in the expanse across the other side, and then there's a little waterfall tucked behind it as well.
Thank you. Councillor Leggett.
Can I just ask, you mentioned about cars driving past.
Yeah.
Can you tell me where the original garage to that bungalow was?
So it is in the ecological report from 2016, the photograph of it, and that's been included in the 2019 application. They referred back to it. The original garage on the plot actually sat behind what is an outside toilet and shed on my father's side. So the Oakroyd bungalow has a little back gate, and the toilet and the shed was directly sort of next to that, perpendicular to the house, and then the garage originally was at the front of the plot, directly behind that toilet, outside toilet in the shed.
So it was in line with the garage that is there now, but further forward.
No. So the original garage is a stone-built garage that was right at the front of the plots. Probably if you stood at the gate as it is now and walked about 20 foot forward to the edge of the Oakroyd property, that's where it would be. I don't know if you can pull up a map of Oakroyd. The corner of the garage was next to the corner of the Oakroyd bungalow, right at the front of the plot. That's where the original stone garage is. There are photographs in the 2016 ecological report that show that it was classed as, I think, building 4, I think.
Yeah,
so yeah,
I'm just trying to ascertain that it was actually closer to your parents' bungalow.
So yeah, the original garage was, this is the original garage that was demolished, because in 2016 it was going to be an integral garage that was part of the actual bungalow that's now been built. But the current developer decided not to have an integral garage. He still knocked down the original garage, and he's chosen to put the garage right at the top of the plot, which means that the cars will now go the full extent of that southern boundary from the road to the top of the garden. Before, the garage the entrance to the garage and the garage itself sat before you got to Oakroyd back garden.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions for the speaker? Thank you. If you now put yourself on mute.
Will do.
Thank you. questions to the officers. And my first question is, how far away is the neighbouring property from the garage? The garage that has now been built.
I think perhaps the best way of doing that, Chair, if I can bring up a slide showing the next door property. It's only taken from the street, but hopefully that will give you a good understanding of that. This is just a street view image. Jen, you can see the next door property here. You can see the new bungalow built here, and the garage is back at the site. So as we again we saw yesterday, this is the taken from the garage door, and this is the bungalow that's been built, and that is Oakroyd that has been referred to, Chair. So the property next door is my words, but hopefully it's a fair summing up. The property next door is to the front of the site, whereas the bungalow and the garage is right to the back.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Kirkham? Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Adrian, is that garage built into it doesn't really show the levels. Is that actually built into the bank of it? Does it bank up at the back?
Again, Chair, if just go back to the photographs, the answer to the question is that the site does rise to the rear.
When I looked at the new stone wall at the back, it looked like it dropped away as well, but it looked like it banked up to me. So where it is, it's less visible than the original one. So for me, should make the site look less prominent. I'm quite happy with that.
Just this photograph is probably the best, Chair. You can see that the garage is sat into the land as it rises to the back with the stone wall.
Yeah, that's the one. Thanks, Adrian. That's fab. Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Kirkham? Councillor Armitage.
Have there been any comments from Derbyshire Wildlife on this site? And how much bigger is this building than what was originally there?
The first answer, Chair, is no, there's been no comments from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. We don't believe we will have consulted them on something of this scale and this size. Just in terms of the size, Chair, I can do no more than go back again to the various drawings that we had, and that we'll be able to see from that slide, Chair, that is the buildings that formerly occupied the site. So I don't think there's any dispute on this. The building that's been introduced is larger than the ones that it replaced. And as you've just heard, it's you can see there what was their primarily single-story structure. But bearing in mind that the point that we just discussed with Councillor Elliott in terms of how the land works, there is that to be taken into account as well. And I don't know how this fell onto the site and how the site may have been modified subsequently. You can see from the outline here, there is certainly a slope on these drawings that were submitted by the applicant, which suggests there was some levels change that's been undertaken now to create the bungalow and the garage that's set into the site rather than perhaps following the previous land levels. But I have no information in respect to that, Chair. I'm just surmising from the drawings that we have.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott.
Thanks, Adrian. There's been a lot made of some block work as well. Can you enlighten us on that, on the block work side of it? Because the rest of it looks really well and sympathetically done to me.
The issue, Chair, is first of all that the application that is before you is for retention of the garage alone. And there has been significant comment made in respect of other elements of the site. And on the approval for the bungalow, there was agreement on boundary treatments. And I believe that is what's taken up quite a lot of comment in the comments made by stakeholders. That as I read the application, that is not before you this afternoon. And if there remains concerns about the boundary treatments, then that would be a matter that would need to be taken up independently. And I'm not prejudging how that will be judged.
Yeah,
But if there's a concern about the boundary treatments, and certainly on the representations which you may have seen that have been submitted to us, on the Oakroyd side of that wall, there is a finish in breeze block.
Right.
And there's an element of the garage, also a small element of it that is also breeze block. Now, as officers, first of all, in terms of the garage, that's not something that we have raised issue with. We feel it's acceptable as the majority of the building is of stone, as you've seen. And in terms of the issues regarding the boundary treatments, that is a matter that may well be between the parties. And we've not, as officers, pursued that independently. But that, my advice, Chair, would be that members judge the garage on its merits this afternoon. If members are concerned about the boundary treatments, then that can be followed up. But there's an element of that, I believe, that it is for the parties to address.
That's great, Adrian. And that's all I needed to know. I just wondered whether it was part of the application or whether it was going to be addressed elsewhere, but you've answered that fully. Thank you.
Any more questions for the planning officer? Right, we'll now move on to the final part of the process. You're waiting for the next bit, right? Okay. Well, we've got to the next bit, so off you go.
Thank you. Well, to be perfectly honest, I know this property and I know it well because I was, as a little girl, I used to visit it with the old lady that lived there before this development. And I can assure you that the garage that was there previously was a lot bigger than that one. And it was at the front of the plot, right next to Mrs. Sanderson's parents' bungalow. It was a large double garage. It was at the front of the plot and it was in direct line with the garage that's there now, but at the front of the plot. The outbuildings at the back, there was quite a few. They weren't derelict back in the day, but I can remember going to look at it when it went up for sale. And the derelict buildings, there were quite a few of them and they were very unsightly. And it is, like you say, well built into the bank. It's much lower than the field. The field rises up at the back. The whole road slopes there. So I personally, I think they've made a lovely job of it. And I think the garage looks really nice. I'm not so keen on the wall, but that's a different issue. But that's my feelings. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Leggett. Any other comments? Okay, right. I now open the floor to motions. Councillor Elliott.
Chair, I move officer recommendation.
It's moved and seconded, moved by Councillor Elliott and seconded by Councillor Armitage.
Then, Chair, with your permission, I'll now take the roll call. Councillor Armitage? Councillor Cooper? Councillor Elliott? Councillor Foster? Councillor Hall? 4. Councillor Hartshorn? 4. Councillor Liggett?
4.
Councillor Jones?
Abstain.
Councillor Powell?
4.
Councillor Rouse?
4.
That's 9, 4 and 1 abstention. The motion passes, Chair.
Right, we now move on to item 7, planning appeals. Now ask Mr. Kirkham to explain our next report, appeals lodged and determined.
Chair, the most weighty element of this report is of those that are appeals lodged. And you can see that there have been 4 appeals lodged. The 2 middle ones, the 2 by W. Redmile and Sons Limited, Chair, relate to a single site. So they're going to be dealt with by single informal hearings. They'll be lodged together.
Sorry, Chair, can I just interrupt at this point? As we made clear yesterday, there was an error sent with the pack. So you actually have a hard copy with you now.
Apologies, Chair. We have subsequently, Chair, had 1 appeal decision handed down to us, and that will have been sent on to members. That will be reported at the end of June in conjunction with others that we may receive in the time. There are a significant number of outstanding appeals that we're waiting for decisions on, and they will start to come through hopefully in the next few weeks. As always, Chair, happy to take questions on these or any other appeals, and I'll answer them if I can.
Any questions? No? Right, well, we now have another item which is about enforcement matters. And I'm going to ask for the officers concerned to be brought in. So we'll have a very short break whilst we change personnel.
So we just need a couple of minutes, Chair, but 5 minutes would be sufficient, certainly.
5 minutes it is. Thank you. All know has been significantly increased recently. So we've had more activity. And I would like one of the officers to explain it to us first. And then I'll open up the floor for questions and discussion. So first of all, welcome to the meeting. We've had a fairly short planning meeting so far, but we will give you all the time you need to explain what you've been doing and the good work you've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Julian Hawley. I'm the Principal Planning Enforcement Officer. I've been at the council now for about 10 months. I'm pleased to say I've been made very welcome. There's a team of 3, 2.6 equivalent posts. And to my left here is Fiona Todd. She's the Senior Planning Enforcement Officer and she joined the council in September. And this is Joanne Edwards. She's the Planning Enforcement Technician and you've been here quite a bit longer, haven't you, Jo? But prior to both myself and Fiona joining the council, the majority of the work was actually dealt with by Jo, and it's fair to say that we wouldn't be where we are without Jo's incredible effort. So, thank you. So the sort of the process for this is set out in the local enforcement plan, and there's a commitment to report to members on a 6-monthly basis, setting out the work that the enforcement team does. Giving you some relevant information on the numbers of cases we receive, what we close, and also formal enforcement action taken by the council, and members will see that in the report that we've produced. So just touching on some of the most important points of it, we've obviously only been here 10 months, and during that time we've been trying to whip our planning database into shape, so that we can actually start to produce these reports without it being an incredibly onerous task, and work on that's ongoing. So thanks to our planning admin team and support officers, they've been brilliant. So just going through the previous year, 2021, the financial year, we've received 358 inquiries in that time. These are inquiries to do with a specific site or a development, and within those there may well be numerous numbers of complainants or inquiries. So this isn't individual people that we're dealing with, that number may well be considerably higher. The average over the previous years, I've just taken a few for context, was 225. So we've seen an 80% increase in this last year in the amount of work that we've been doing as a team. And that's actually reflected across lots of other councils. We form part of a Derbyshire Enforcement Officers group, and they're reporting similar increases in numbers of cases that are being dealt with. You know, that's probably a consequence of coming out of the pandemic. Some people have got more disposable income than others, but also the way that people are choosing to live their lives now has changed significantly. You know, people running businesses from homes or putting summer houses and things in gardens. So that may well be the reason for that. Also, as part of the work that we've been doing, we do carry out proactive enforcement investigations, so that when we're out and about in the district looking at things, we'll call in at sites and check on what's happening. If there's things we see, we'll go back to the office and check they've got planning permission. And if they have, then we'll obviously check that the conditions are being complied with. So that's part of a more proactive service which we're intending to offer. So, as I've said in the report, we're constantly striving to improve the way that we store and retrieve information. A lot of work's going on at the moment in terms of getting an electronic enforcement notice register set up. So at the moment, that's just purely in a paper format, sat in the office. It's not really very functional for people, members of the public, if they want to interrogate it. So we're trying to combine our sort of public access mapping system with enforcement notice register, bring service improvements to land charges and people wanting to find information out themselves. So as you can appreciate, there's hundreds of notices stored in various places which we have to retrieve, upload, make sure they're properly presented, look at what the status of each of those enforcement notices is, whether it's complied with, varied, appeals dealt with, those kind of things. So, this is one of a number of big tasks which we're doing in the background to sort of streamline our service and make it better and easy to deal with, I suppose. So just going through the breakdown of closures, we are actively trying to record exactly how we deal with planning enforcement inquiries. So what we've managed to pull together is to give you some idea as to exactly the reasons why we close inquiries. So that could be to do with the fact it's not a planning breach,
And the report finds that about 40% of the work which we deal with isn't actually a breach of planning control. But each of that may well be because it's permitted development, something allowed, by the permitted development order. But each of these has to be investigated. So it's still officer time going out to look at it, deal with the people who own the properties and deal with the people who are inquiring. And 20% of our workload is resolved with through planning applications. So, there is a right within the Planning Act to make retrospective planning applications for development. And those are the figures which have been approved. There may well be a number which have been refused, and then that comes back on our desk to consider for formal enforcement action or whatever. But so hopefully members will find that useful, and we're streamlining that to make sure that the information we present is easy to understand, gives you some context. Then just going to the end of the report, this is the formal enforcement action which has been taken in the last financial year. And we've just given you a little bit of an update as to what the situation, the status is with those notices. So a number at the moment have been issued and are in the appeal process, and we're obviously dealing with the planning inspectorate on those. We've had some success in terms of taking direct action in some enforcement cases, and that's something that we'll look to do more of in the future. So we're working with the assistant director to put forward tendering documents so that we can send out some tender proposals for contractors to look to take direct action on our behalf. And then just at the end there, there's sort of other notices which we've issued in that time, community protection warning notices and also planning contravention notices, but they don't form part of the planning register and they're confidential at this stage. What we are able to disclose is where we have taken formal enforcement action. So hopefully that's sets out what we're trying to do, and we'll report back to you every 6 months with updates, and hopefully the more we go through this process, the more the information and the numbers will start to make sense. Obviously, you'll see that we've got a significant backlog of cases at the moment, and we're dealing with that backlog as well as trying to deal with the uptick in work that we've got. So there's a lot of pressures on us, and we're trying our best. So hopefully you found it useful, and welcome any questions or anything anybody's got.
Thank you, Julian. Anybody wants a comment or question? Councillor Liggett and then Councillor Foster.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you actually for what you're doing, because you've certainly helped me on numerous occasions, and particularly with questions and about conservation areas, etc., and quite a few little problems we've had. So I just wanted to thank you very much for what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. That's really appreciated.
Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thanks very much for coming along, and thanks for that report. It's great to see that as a first report. If I add to it, in 2019, as an administration, we know we inherited a massive backlog of cases that need looking into. And without pointing fingers or anything like that, we know that at that time we only had one part-time staff, so half a person on the job, which is why that backlog was there. Now we've got that 2.6, you say, yourself, Fiona, and Joanne. I can see that you are doing so much work. You could easily point at the 80% with the increase there, and you give the reason for this. One of the reasons being proactive enforcement investigation by the enforcement team. I can see that, and I know that from people I've spoken to. It's that proactive engagement with the community which has encouraged more people to come forward. So absolutely, and I do think we need more of that. So as well as proposing to follow recommendations in noting this report, I'd like to propose a vote of thanks to your team, because I think you've done absolutely excellent, really, and it's so great to see. It really is. It's heartwarming. It means that this, the people in North East Derbyshire are getting a real service, for the money they pay, for the taxes they pay. So, on behalf of my residents, thank you very much. I'd like to propose that.
Before we have, it's not a motion, I know it's a proposal, but before we have that, anyone else want to comment? Councillor Armitage.
Well, all I'd say is that both of them came to us with quite a reputation, and I know where they came from. They were sorely missed, And I'm glad to have got you on board. And you're doing a great job between you.
Thank you. It's worth pointing out, you know, we are part of a wider team, and the support we get from Adrian and the planning officers is absolutely incredible. So, you know, a lot of this is because we work so well as a whole service. So it's, you know, thanks to those as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, I'll just make a comment before we actually go through to the recommendations, and that is that clearly things are so much better than they were. But I would hope that, well, I know from the area that I'm in that people now realise they can't get away with things. And I would hope that your workload diminishes, to be honest, as people realise that, you know, let's not breach the regulations in the first place. I think there had been a feeling that, well, we'll put that illegal sign up and nobody will bother. Well, we do bother now. And I think that's a very significant step forward. So what we're being asked to do is to note the report and effectively approve it. And you would like to recommend that, Councillor Foster?
I'd like to recommend that for the recommendations, but I'd like it to be recorded in the minutes. A vote of thanks to this team, please, with your permission, Chair.
Right. I think we can do that with a show of hands, can we?
I think so, Chair, yes.
Everybody happy with that? Right, well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to you, Julian, Fiona, and Joanne. You have our absolute backing, and we are grateful for all the work you've done and the structures and systems you've put in place. So, thank you very much. We haven't done anything. No. Next item is urgent business. I haven't got any urgent business, so I will thank you for your attendance and declare the meeting closed. Thank you.